An important date in history is marked in May of 1635, the date being the first settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Although this colony consisted of mostly Puritans who immigrated from England, there were others who wanted to separate and establish themselves, including a man by the name of Tristram Coffin. He was born in 1604 to a family of middle class in western England. He had been a royalist during the English Civil War, and when the king was deposed and Oliver Cromwell was newly put into place, he decided to up and move his family to New England. When arriving in Massachusetts, he moved around a lot before choosing to inherit land in Nantucket and leave property in Newbury to his son, Tristram Coffin Jr. Tristram Jr. then built the house in Newbury in 1678, an established fact made through the process of dendrochronology. Up until 2003, the original structure was thought to be built in 1654. Aside from the actual building date, when Tristram Jr. came to Newbury with his parents, siblings, and relatives in 1643, it was a frontier settlement and included Indian tribes nearby, wild animals, and few roads. The town's economy was a combination of mostly agriculture, and in 1642, Newbury was the home of a mere 455 people. Limited amounts of manufacturers and artisans were around. Although conditions may have been harsh, this is where he began his new life, and a legacy is shown through his house that would last throughout the ages. From 1678, the house was continuously occupied by several succeeding generations of Coffins, each whom actively participated in the socio-economic, political, and educational life of the town. The original home structure lies in the changes of the original structure built, and how it was changed over time to accommodate the certain needs of domestic life throughout the centuries of 6 generations. This is where our story begins.
This is where the story begins.
The earliest part of the house, also known as the Southwest L, is a perfect example of first period or post-medieval style. When building the house, Tristram had to take into consideration the growing population of Newbury and the more severe climate of New England. At this time, the house was also dimly lit and dark, reflecting furnishings of a 16th century home. Typical of early buildings at the time, the main facade faced south to maximize warmth from the sun in the winter. Tristram also built a porch with a chamber above off the south side of the house for spending time with his family in and soaking up the pleasant summer days. The original house was built with the raw materials of wood for the outer and basic structure, and then exposed clay and straw for wall fillings, as well as separation between rooms. One of the most noted parts of the home lies in the main hall, illustrating a time when the original inhabitants, or Tristram and Judith, were living there. It originally consisted of one room, with no partitions. However, as time went by, the needs of the family changed. Partitions were added as a result of this, as this room was the place where most events in family life would have taken place, such as cooking and eating together, as well as spinning, sewing, and visiting from various people. Clothing was made here by hand on the spinning wheel, and machine goods were constructed in the sitting room, usually a division of the house where the men worked and resided. The hall chamber was necessary for establishment as well, used for storage and sleeping of various family members and guests. Having grand rooms like this provided for means of power and space, as the wealthier had larger, immense rooms to demonstrate their own wealth. The existing beds in the house today are those from 1720 and 1740, each made with a thick stitching supporting by a feather bed, allowing for less holes and tears and support for whoever was sleeping. Tristram Coffin Jr. and his wife lived into the house until they died in 1704 and 1705. Nathaniel, their youngest son, inherited the land after they died, and in 1693 brought his wife and children into the home. In 1712, the Coffin family added the front range to the house. It was a large and imposing addition that faced High Road. This new piece also demonstrates important changes in Newbury in the 18th century. The road in front of the house had been constructed so that the houses were reoriented to face it, so the front of the house would nearly face north, instead of the south-facing version from 1678. This new piece included plaster between ceiling joists in the southeast chamber, as well as a chamfered roof frame. An elegant feature introduced in the 1690s, known as a plaster cove cornice, was introduced, and can also be traced back to the other houses built in the period, for example, the Benaiah Titcomb House and the Pillsbury House. Another change Nathaniel made was the chimney bay in the L being made wider, and the chimney itself was rebuilt to include fireplaces facing both ways. The fireplaces themselves became enormous to supply food to the Coffin descendants. However, there was not a single roaring blaze over which the meal fires with pots suspended over each. This could be said to foreshadow the later 3 or 4 burner stove. At the same time, the fireplace was necessary for efficiency and preparing several things at once. Bake ovens and fireplaces originated at the back, and as time progressed migrated to the front. Around this time, another furniture addition added to the house was the adult cradle, still existing in its original form today. It was used for an elderly or invalid member of the family. The youngest would rock the oldest and the most affirmed in this. One of the most important rooms constructed around this time was the buttery, significant for storage and making dairy for the family. Families were also accountable for making and providing means of food for their members, and it also helped that the room in which this took place was also the coolest in the house, shuttered to keep out the heat during humid summer days. Inside there were appliances for food production, including earthenware milk pans and jugs, split boxes and baskets, and food grinders, all essential means for production at the time. Nathaniel was also known for his starting of a tanning business that would sustain his family well into the 1800s. Like his father, he was very involved in Newbury affairs, being a deacon of the church and serving the colony as a representative to the general court from 1719 to 1721. The house saw the start of a new generation, when Nathaniel's son Joseph brought home his bride Margaret to set up housekeeping. Joseph and his son Joshua continued the tanning business, while at the same time maintaining orchards, pasture, and livestock. Joseph held the office of Newbury Town Clerk consecutively. During this time, the town's population was growing tremendously, and rapid growth was in the air. Little changes were made to the house as the years went on. The next major change done to accommodate evolving times came in 1799. At this time, the house had been legally divided by Edmund Coffin and his brother Joseph. Both wanted a piece of their deceased father's estate, and so the back half of the home was given to Joseph and the front to Edmund. Each had exclusive use of certain rooms, stairways, etc., with right of passage through other rooms on occasion. The major change, done to accommodate the two different families under the same roof, was the addition of an entire second floor. When the two brothers died, it was their children that continued to live in the house, starting in the 19th century. Their names were Lucy and Joshua I. This generation was well aware of the importance of a house that had remained so unchanged throughout the years. However, they had no real interest of living in the house. A series of family members inherited the dwelling for brief periods of time after Lucy and Joseph died, but not too many stayed. The sitting room shows how the last generation of Coffins lived in the house. For the first time in the house history, there was a space set aside for pursuits based primarily on art and intellectual adventure. Many of the Coffin sons went to Harvard, and the women were gifted as well, being scholarly, artistic, and musical. It was Lucy's niece, Margaret Coleman, who inherited both sides of the house and gave it to the New England Historic District in 1929. It is important to also note textiles from England were important throughout their generations. The walls were painted lightly with flowers, designs that are faded today. Tiles were pasted on the walls of the parlor to create a scene for weddings. Another important item was the spinet, a place where the fanciest furniture in the house would have been found. The spinet itself is English, although most of the other furniture had been locally made. An important piano stands today in the corner of the parlor for entertainment during celebratory events. With rooms from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, this house depicts the impact of the economy and new concepts. For example, concepts such as the notion of privacy and modes of living in everyday life can be expressed. These are things that are still expressed in the Coffin House today, an important structure in the history of New England. Our history can be traced back to the lives of people over 300 years ago. The Tristram Coffin House has luckily been preserved very well, as it is the only surviving example of Western English framing in New England. Apart from the additions made over time, the structure has remained largely unchanged. We are lucky to know where our history lies, and that some of it will be preserved. Tristram Coffin left his legacy deep in American soil through this house that stands as the oldest building in the Newbury Historic District today. Our footprints are what matters to America. Always think of what the future holds. The question is, how will the future remember you?